On a winter morning in January 2006, the quiet streets of South London carried on as if nothing was wrong. Children hurried to school, shopkeepers rolled up their shutters, and neighbors exchanged polite greetings. But inside one unassuming house in Mitcham, something unthinkable was happening. Banaz Mahmud, just 20 years old, had been left alone while her parents went about their day. Hours earlier, she had spoken of her fear. She had named the people she believed were plotting her death. She had even given police a written list of names. By then, she had already told officers 5 times that she was in grave danger. But no one believed her. As the morning wore on, 3 men entered the home, her own cousins. What followed would later be pieced together from phone records, prison conversations, and forensic evidence. It was a prolonged attack, deliberate, brutal, and final. Banaz was strangled inside the very house where she had once sought safety. Her killers didn't stop there. In a calculated attempt to erase her existence, they forced her body into a suitcase, drove it out of London, and buried it in a suburban back garden in Birmingham. For months, her family claimed to know nothing, while her partner desperately begged police to search for her. Beneath the soil, Banaz lay hidden, her voice silenced, but not erased. When detectives finally uncovered the truth, they realized this was not only a murder. It was a carefully planned honor killing, sanctioned by her own father and uncle, and executed by relatives who claimed loyalty to family tradition over human life. This is the story of Banaz Mahmud, of the warnings she gave that were ignored, the betrayal she suffered at the hands of her own family, and the relentless investigation that fought to bring her killers to justice. Welcome to the Crime Series. Before we begin, do us a quick favor. Drop your location and the time you're watching this in the comments. We want to know where you're tuning in from, because these stories matter everywhere. Like this video, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. On the 16th of December 1985, nestled in the rural tribal landscape of Muradale near Kaladiza in Iraqi Kurdistan, a baby girl was born into the Mahmud family, Banaz Mahmud. She was one of 6 children, a son and 5 daughters born to Mahmud Babakir Mahmud and his wife Behia. Deeply rooted in Kurdish tribal traditions, the Mahmuds adhered to rigid cultural codes where honor and reputation governed daily life, particularly for women. In 1995, as Iraq faced political unrest, the Mahmuds sought asylum in the United Kingdom, settling in Mitcham, South London, when Banaz was around 10 years old. Although Mahmud was the eldest of his 4 brothers, authority within the family rested firmly with his younger sibling, Ari Aga Mahmud, who assumed the role of patriarch, a signifier both of interpersonal family dynamics and cultural hierarchy. Life in London offered a stark contrast to the tribal regime of Muradale. While the family maintained tight bonds and continued to observe traditional norms, Banaz was introduced to a different reality. Schools that encouraged self-expression, a society that valued personal choice, and freedoms that seemed tantalizingly close yet distant. In the midst of this liminal space, Banaz was caught between 2 identities: her family's expectations and the broader British world that beckoned. The Mahmud girls, including Banaz, endured the oppressive legacy of tradition. They were subjected to female genital mutilation, a harrowing practice emblematic of community beliefs around purity and control. The oppressive environment grew increasingly stifling for some. Betrayal, Banaz's older sister, had vanished from the family home in 2002, fleeing the threat of violence and oppressive restrictions. She entered foster care and remained in hiding, cloaked in secrecy, her every public appearance marked by fear, and her survival bound by the limitations of her dual identity. Before fleeing, Betrayal had reported being subjected to physical abuse and threats because she mixed with people her family disapproved of and experimented with Western clothing and hairstyles. An attempt was made on her life, and her father threatened to kill her mother, sisters, and himself if she didn't return home. Mahmud's failure to control Betrayal was viewed as weakness within the Kurdish community, and he was subjected to a degree of ostracism as a result. This community judgment would later play a crucial role in the pressure to restore the family's honor through more drastic measures. The next sister, Payman, known as Paisy, faced similar restrictions. At just 16 years old, she was forced into marriage with a man 15 years her senior, a union that Banaz would later observe with growing regret and apprehension. These experiences underscored a chilling truth. Within the Mahmud household, daughters were expected to remain obedient, silent, and confined. Banaz, however, was more reserved and observant than her sisters. As a child, she attended local schools, embraced the English language, and navigated the dual worlds of tradition and modernity. Outwardly, the family presented a veneer of normalcy, devoted parents, dutiful children. Yet beneath that surface lay a world of enforced compliance. Banaz's demeanor reflected the guarded strength of someone attuned to both worlds, but belonging fully to neither. In 2002, Banaz's life took a decisive turn. In many ways, she was still adjusting to London, still learning to reconcile the quiet, sometimes timid girl who had grown up in Iraqi Kurdistan with the teenager navigating the noise and diversity of British streets. But within her family, expectations did not bend to geography. The values her father, uncle, and extended relatives upheld were rooted in the traditions of their homeland, traditions they believed should remain untouched by Western influence. Subsequently, she was compelled into an arranged, forced marriage to Ali Abbas, a man from her Kurdish hometown, Kaladiza. He was around many years older, illiterate, and described by Banaz as harboring a mindset equivalent to someone from 50 years prior. This marriage was a snapshot of her family's adherence to cultural tradition, a union dictated by community expectations rather than personal agency. The wedding itself, while festive on the surface, marked the beginning of an increasingly restrictive chapter in her life. Her husband, though a familiar figure within the community, was not the caring partner she might have hoped for. Instead, Banaz quickly encountered a household where her movements were closely monitored, her interactions scrutinized, and her voice diminished. She was expected to prioritize her husband's needs, avoid contact with certain people, and adhere strictly to the boundaries he and his family set. In private, Banaz experienced what she would later describe as a growing climate of control and intimidation. He was a strict husband, Banaz would later say on camera. Whenever he wanted to have intimacy, it was just his way. He wouldn't take no for an answer. He said to me that he'd kill me if I said anything to anyone. Arguments would erupt over matters she considered trivial: how she dressed, who she spoke to, how she conducted herself in public. Her world shrank, and the glimpses of independence she had begun to taste in London vanished. Isolated from much of the outside world, Banaz's contact with her own family became a lifeline. Yet even that was complicated. In the early months of her marriage, she attempted to confide in her parents about the difficulties she was facing, but the responses she received were tinged with resignation. Divorce, she was reminded, was frowned upon. Leaving a marriage could bring shame, not only to herself but to the entire family. In this way, her unhappiness was treated less as a problem to be solved and more as an obstacle she was expected to endure. Banaz's father, Mahmud, was a respected figure in the community and someone whose approval she had always sought. Yet when it came to her marriage, his stance was firm. Upholding family honor mattered more than personal comfort. For Banaz, the realization that her father would not support her if she left her husband was both devastating and clarifying. It meant that any attempt to escape her circumstances would have to come from her own determination, not from the safety net of family protection. Over time, the psychological weight of her situation deepened. Her husband's behavior grew more unpredictable, and she felt as though she was under constant surveillance, not only within her home, but within the broader Kurdish network in London. In such tightly knit circles, word traveled quickly, and she knew that any perceived misstep could be reported back to her husband or her family. There were moments when Banaz tried to hold on to hope, telling herself that the tension might ease, that she might find a way to adapt. But these thoughts became harder to sustain. The rare occasions when she ventured out on her own, or spent brief moments away from her husband's oversight, served only to remind her of the freedom she had lost. The gap between the life she wanted and the life she was living grew impossible to ignore. Banaz endured repeated sexual assault and physical violence from the man she had been forced to wed. She reported these horrors multiple times to the police, another attempt to seek help that ultimately ended in silence and shame. Yet instead of support, she faced pressure to persevere, as her family argued that divorcing him would bring dishonor upon them. Ultimately, after 2 years of suffering, Banaz found the courage to return home in July 2005, leaving the marriage behind, but not without deep emotional and psychological scars. Leaving the marriage might have seemed like a chance at freedom, but for Banaz, it marked the beginning of a far more dangerous chapter in her life. The separation placed her in direct conflict with the deeply ingrained notions of honor upheld by some members of her family and wider community. In their eyes, divorce was not just a personal matter, it was a public shame. For Banaz, however, the decision to leave was an act of survival. The violent outbursts she had endured, the suffocating control, and the absence of genuine love had left her with little choice. Moving back into her parents' home in Mitcham, South London, she tried to rebuild her life quietly. Yet beneath the surface, the tension between Banaz and her family was growing. Her return brought her back under the watchful eye of her father, Mahmud Babakir Mahmud, and other male relatives who viewed her independence as a threat. It was during this time that Banaz met Rahmat Suleimani, a young Iranian Kurdish man from a similar background. Unlike the controlling figures in her past, Rahmat treated her with respect and kindness. The two formed a relationship, finding in each other a sense of comfort and understanding. But their relationship, conducted openly in modern London, violated the strict expectations of her family. For Banaz's father and uncle, her seeing Rahmat without their consent, and after leaving a husband they had chosen, was considered deeply dishonorable. The relationship became known to the family when a member of the Kurdish community spotted Banaz and Rahmat kissing outside a tube station and reported it back to her relatives. This single moment of affection, witnessed by someone from their community, would seal both their fates. At home, Banaz began living a more autonomous life. She quietly kept company with Rahmat Suleimani, the man she had chosen herself, a step that represented her longing for self-determination and love. This, however, was perceived by her family as an act of defiance, one that broke the tight reins of control woven by her father and uncle. Banaz's aspirations, her desire to study, to love, to survive, were never grandiose. She sought only the right to live freely. Yet in the context of her family's worldview, her small acts of autonomy were tantamount to rebellion. Silently, she emerged as a young woman, straining against oppressive shackles, her hopes both fragile and untamed. By December 2, 2005, after 2 years out of her forced marriage and in a relationship with Rahmat Suleimani, Banaz overheard something chilling. At a family meeting presided over by her uncle Ari Aga Mahmud at his home in Mitcham, it was agreed that Banaz and Rahmat must be killed to preserve the family's honor. The decision was deliberate, cold, and irrevocable. All male family members were present at this council of war, where Ari Aga Mahmud declared that both Banaz and Rahmat were bringing shame on the family and that they are going to die. Recognizing the peril she faced, Banaz turned to the authorities not once but repeatedly. She made at least 5 pleas to police and, on December 12, 2005, submitted a handwritten letter naming those she believed would kill her. Every step was an attempt to be heard, a documented cry for help. Just weeks later, on New Year's Eve, the danger escalated dramatically. Her father lured Banaz to her grandmother's house in Wimbledon, under the pretense of discussing her divorce. He asked her to carry a large, empty suitcase from the car into the living room when they arrived, a detail that would later take on sinister significance. With the curtains drawn, her father forced Banaz to drink brandy, her first taste of alcohol as a Muslim woman. He put on blue surgical gloves and Reebok trainers, constantly telling her not to look at him and that she would soon begin to feel sleepy. Terrified but still alert, Banaz realized her father was planning to murder her. When he left the room briefly, she ran into the back garden and smashed her grandmother's window with her bare hands in a desperate attempt to get help. When no one responded, she stumbled out into the street and collapsed, bleeding, outside a cafe in Wimbledon, where an ambulance was called. She ended up in hospital, shaken and bleeding, where paramedics described her as so frightened that she wouldn't leave the ambulance until a security guard was present. Banaz gave her account of events to her boyfriend, which Ramat secretly recorded on his phone and later handed to the police. The recording captured her terror and the details of her father's attempt on her life at her grandmother's house. Yet despite her injuries and fear, the response she received would prove to be one of the most damaging failures in the entire case. PC Angela Cornens, the officer who responded to the emergency call, made a series of critical errors that would later be scrutinized by investigators. Rather than taking Banaz's allegations seriously, Cornens dismissed her as manipulative and melodramatic. In her witness statement, she described the traumatized young woman as dramatic and calculating. Instead of investigating Banaz's claims that her father had tried to kill her at her grandmother's house, Cornens wanted to charge her with criminal damage for breaking her grandmother's window during her escape from what was clearly an attempted murder. Most alarmingly, PC Cornens violated established police guidelines by directly approaching Banaz's father to ask about his daughter's allegations of attempted murder. This move, explicitly forbidden in police protocols for honor-based violence cases, effectively alerted the family that Banaz had contacted officers and potentially escalated the danger she faced. It was a moment of tragic irony. Banaz had officially reported her own imminent demise and was disbelieved. No safeguarding efforts were made. On January 22nd, just 2 days before her disappearance, there was an escalation that should have triggered immediate protective action. An attempt was made to kidnap Ramat Suleimani. 3 of the men involved were among those whom Banaz had already named to the police in her written statement. Both she and Ramat separately reported this incident, providing corroborating evidence of the immediate danger they faced. If you've stayed with us this far, you know how critical it is that stories like Banaz are told and remembered. Take a moment now to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next case we cover. And if you believe more people should hear this story, please share this video. It helps us keep her voice alive. By late January 2006, the pressure around 20-year-old Banaz Mahmud had been building for weeks. She had already told officers in plain terms that she feared for her life and had submitted a written list of names she believed were threatening her. The recent attempt to kidnap her partner should have been the final warning that immediate action was needed. Yet on the morning of Tuesday, January 24th, when her parents left their home in Mitcham, South London, the routine details of a normal day, school run, shopping, were the last ordinary notes in a story about to turn irrevocably dark. The morning began with what appeared to be ordinary family routines. Mahmud and his wife Behia prepared to leave the house, ostensibly to take their youngest daughter to school and go shopping. But this departure was far from innocent. It was a carefully orchestrated part of a murder plot that had been weeks in the making. Banaz remained at home, resting in the front room of the family house. She was scheduled to return to the police station later that day to update officers about the ongoing threats to her life, an appointment that represented her continued hope that the authorities might finally provide the protection she desperately needed. She had no way of knowing that her parents' departure was the signal her killers had been waiting for. What made this betrayal particularly heinous was that Banaz's own parents deliberately informed 3 of her male cousins that she was alone in the house. This was not an oversight or coincidence. It was a calculated act of delivery, handing their daughter over to her executioners. The parents, who should have been her ultimate protection, had instead become complicit in her murder, choosing family honor over their daughter's life. She may have been planning what to tell the police later that day, perhaps hoping that this time they would take her fears seriously enough to provide real protection. The irony is devastating. She never made it to that appointment because the very people she had named as threats were already on their way to her door. Mohammad Marid Hama, Mohammed Saleh Ali, and Omar Hussein arrived at the property. These three men were not acting on impulse or in a moment of rage. They had been specifically recruited by Banaz Mahmud to carry out the family's death sentence. Their arrival was timed, coordinated, and part of a broader plan that extended far beyond the immediate act of murder. The men who entered that house were not strangers to Banaz. They were her cousins, young men she had known since childhood, members of her extended family who should have protected her. Instead, they had accepted the role of executioners in the name of restoring family honor. This betrayal by blood relatives, combined with her parents' complicity, represents one of the most chilling aspects of honor-based violence. The way it turns families into instruments of destruction against their own members. What happened next would later be reconstructed through the perpetrator's own words, captured in covert prison recordings that revealed the horrifying details of Banaz's final hours. The details that emerged from these recordings, later scrutinized in court, revealed the calculated cruelty of the assault. Banaz was subjected to systematic rape and torture, with her attackers taking turns to inflict different forms of violence. She was kicked and stamped on repeatedly, with Hama later boasting in his recorded prison conversations about kicking and stamping on Banaz's neck to get her soul out. During this prolonged assault, Banaz would have known that she was going to die. The men who were attacking her made no attempt to conceal their intentions or their identities. They wanted her to know who was killing her and why. The recordings revealed that throughout this ordeal, Banaz begged for her life. She pleaded with her cousins, perhaps appealing to childhood memories or family bonds, but her appeals fell on deaf ears. The men attacking her saw themselves not as murderers, but as instruments of justice, restoring family honor through violence. In their minds, her pleas only confirmed her guilt, evidence of the shame and defiance that had made her death necessary in the first place. She was also sexually assaulted by own cousins. It was hell. The sexual violence was particularly significant within the context of honor-based killing. It represented not just cruelty but a specific form of punishment for a young woman who had dared to choose her own romantic partner. After more than 2 hours of torture, the attack culminated in Banaz's murder. She was strangled with a ligature, specifically a garrote that had been brought for the purpose. This was not a crime of passion or a killing that got out of hand. It was a planned execution carried out with tools brought specifically for the task. In the moments after Banaz Mahmud's brutal murder in her family's living room on January 24, 2006, her killers moved with chilling efficiency. Mohammad Marid Hama, Mohammed Saleh Ali, and Omar Hussein knew that their work was far from finished. The body of their victim lay in the family home, where neighbors might notice unusual activity, where forensic evidence could link them to the scene, and where discovery seemed inevitable if they acted carelessly. The plan they implemented next revealed the calculated, premeditated nature of not just the murder, but the conspiracy that surrounded it. Working quickly but methodically, the three men wrapped Banaz's body and placed it in a suitcase, quite possibly the same large suitcase her father had asked her to carry into her grandmother's house on New Year's Eve. What happened next would later shock investigators with its scope and organization. This was not simply a family trying to cover up a crime of passion. It was a community-wide conspiracy involving at least 50 people who would play various roles in concealing Banaz's murder. Some assisted in the planning phases, others in the execution, still more in the disposal of evidence, and many in providing false testimony designed to protect the perpetrators and mislead investigators. Dana Amin, another of Banaz's cousins who had not participated directly in the killing, became crucial to the cover-up operation. Using his black Lexus, he helped transport Banaz's body from the crime scene in South London. The journey they undertook was not random. The destination had been carefully chosen to maximize the chances that the body would never be found, or if discovered, that it would be too far removed from the original crime scene to provide useful forensic evidence. The vehicle made its way north through London's sprawling suburbs. The destination was a house in Handsworth, Birmingham, a seemingly unremarkable property in a quiet residential area, chosen precisely because of its anonymity. The back garden of this house would become Banaz's unmarked grave for nearly 3 months. Working under cover of darkness, the conspirators dug a deep hole in the garden's soil. The depth was significant. This wasn't a hasty burial, but a methodical attempt to ensure the body would remain hidden indefinitely. They placed the suitcase containing Banaz's remains into the excavated hole and carefully backfilled it with soil and garden debris. The surface was restored to appear undisturbed, with plants and garden materials arranged to mask any evidence of the excavation. To any casual observer, the garden looked entirely normal, a suburban patch of green that revealed no hint of the horror buried beneath. The choice of Birmingham was strategically calculated. Not only did it place the body over 100 miles from the murder scene, but it also moved the evidence across police force boundaries. The killers understood that investigations could become complicated when multiple police forces were involved, creating potential delays and jurisdictional confusion that might work in their favor. January 25, 2006, one day after Banaz's murder began like any other morning for Ramat Suleimani, but by its end, his world would be forever changed. For months, he and Banaz had maintained constant contact, a lifeline of text messages and phone calls that sustained their relationship despite the mounting threats from her family. They would text each other throughout the day, sharing small moments and reassurances, their phones serving as umbilical cords connecting two hearts trying to survive in an increasingly dangerous world. Banaz was scheduled to return to Wimbledon Police Station on January 24th to update officers about the escalating threats against both their lives. The attempted kidnapping of Ramat just 2 days earlier had shaken them both, but it had also seemed to finally convince the authorities that the danger was real and immediate. For the first time in months, they had felt a glimmer of hope that someone might actually help them. But Banaz never made it to that appointment. As hours passed without word from Banaz, Ramat's concern transformed into genuine alarm. He tried calling her mobile phone repeatedly, each attempt going straight to voicemail, each unanswered ring amplifying his fear. He tried texting, hoping that perhaps she was somewhere she couldn't speak freely but could at least send a quick message to let him know she was safe. Nothing. The attempted kidnapping of January 22nd replayed in his mind. 3 men, among those Banaz had already named to police as potential threats, had tried to lure him into a car. They had been brazen about it, approaching him in broad daylight, confident that their community connections would protect them from consequences. Only his quick thinking and refusal to get in the vehicle had saved him. If they were bold enough to attempt kidnapping him in public, what might they do to Banaz in the privacy of her family home? On the morning of January 25, 2006, Ramat Suleimani made the phone call that would eventually lead to one of the most significant honor-based violence investigations in British history. Despite his limited English and his own vulnerable status as someone who had been targeted for kidnapping just days earlier, he contacted the Metropolitan Police to report that his girlfriend was missing. The initial response was everything Banaz had learned to expect from the authorities: skeptical, dismissive, and culturally tone-deaf. The officer who took Ramat's call seemed far more interested in the nature of his relationship with Banaz than in the possibility that she might be in danger. Questions focused on whether they had argued, whether she might have decided to leave him, whether this was simply a case of a young woman exercising her right to go where she pleased without checking in with her boyfriend. Ramat tried to explain the context: the family meeting where her death had been planned, the multiple threats reported to police, the handwritten letter naming her potential killers. the attempted kidnapping just days before. But without the cultural knowledge to understand the seriousness of honor-based threats, the responding officers failed to grasp the urgency of the situation. When police contacted Banaz's family about Ramat's missing person report, they encountered what appeared to be a completely different narrative. Her parents, Mahmud Mahmud and his wife Behia, presented themselves as unconcerned and slightly annoyed by the fuss. Banaz, they claimed, was known to stay out overnight occasionally. She was a grown woman who came and went as she pleased. They portrayed themselves as a modern, tolerant family who didn't impose strict curfews on their adult daughter. Lesser men might have accepted the initial dismissal and hoped for the best. But Ramat Suleimani possessed a combination of love for Banaz and understanding of her family dynamics that made him impossible to dissuade. He knew that Banaz's parents were lying. He knew that their casual attitude toward her disappearance was not evidence of her freedom but proof of their involvement in her fate. Over the following days, Ramat became what officers would later describe as harassment of the police. A relentless campaign of phone calls, visits to police stations, and demands for action. He refused to accept explanations that Banaz had simply chosen to disappear. He provided officers with details about the family meeting where her death had been planned, the threats that had escalated over recent weeks, and the suspicious behavior of family members since her disappearance. Each time he contacted police, Ramat risked his own safety. He was, after all, also a target of the same conspiracy that had threatened Banaz. Ramat's refusal to accept official indifference gradually forced authorities to take a closer look at the case. As he continued to provide information about the family's threats and behavior, investigators began to see inconsistencies in the parents' account of their daughter's disappearance. Cross-checking against phone records revealed that Mahmoud was not the indulgent, modern father he claimed to be. Banaz's phone showed evidence of constant monitoring and control that contradicted the family's portrayal of her as free to come and go as she pleased. More importantly, investigators finally began to connect Ramat's missing person report with the multiple complaints Banaz had made to police over the previous months. When these scattered reports were compiled and analyzed together, they revealed not a series of unrelated incidents, but a clear escalation of threats culminating in a credible murder plot. The revelation that Banaz had submitted a handwritten list naming the men she believed would kill her, and that some of those same men had been involved in the attempted kidnapping of Ramat just days before her disappearance, transformed the case from a routine missing person inquiry into a potential murder investigation. The investigation's turning point came when Detective Chief Inspector Caroline Good took personal charge of the case. Unlike the officers who had initially dismissed both Banaz's complaints and Ramat's missing person report, DCI Good immediately recognized the cultural and criminal patterns that indicated honor-based violence. She understood that in cases of honor killing, families routinely present false narratives to authorities, while community members provide coordinated support for these deceptions. She recognized that Ramat's persistent reporting, far from being harassment, represented crucial intelligence from someone with intimate knowledge of both the victim and the threat network. Most importantly, DCI Good understood that time was critical. If Banaz was still alive, every hour of delay reduced the chances of finding her safely. If she was already dead, every day that passed would make it more difficult to gather evidence and secure convictions for her killers. Under DCI Good's leadership, the investigation finally received the resources, expertise, and urgency that it had always deserved. Specialist teams were deployed. Surveillance operations were initiated. The case was treated not as a domestic dispute or cultural misunderstanding, but as a serious organized crime involving multiple suspects and requiring sophisticated investigative techniques. While the investigation team prepared for arrests and searches, analysts began examining phone records and digital evidence. What they discovered provided the first concrete proof that something had gone terribly wrong on January 24th. Banaz's mobile phone had gone completely silent after the morning of January 24th. No calls, no texts, no network activity of any kind. For someone who typically sent dozens of messages daily to Ramat, this sudden silence was more than suspicious. It was virtually conclusive proof that something had prevented her from accessing her phone. More telling still were the phone records of the suspects. The men Banaz had named in her letter showed unusual patterns of communication on January 24th and 25th. There were calls between family members at odd times, brief conversations that suggested coordination, and most significantly, the complete absence of any attempts to contact Banaz herself. Unusual behavior for family members genuinely concerned about a missing relative. Analysis of cell tower data revealed the movement of various phones on the days surrounding Banaz's disappearance. Several phones, registered with towers along routes between London and Birmingham, suggesting travel that would later prove significant when the burial location was discovered. Good understood that she would have only one opportunity to catch the suspects before they could coordinate their stories or dispose of evidence. The investigation would need to proceed with military precision, hitting multiple targets simultaneously before the network could respond. On February 2, 2006, coordinated raids were launched across South London. Teams of officers simultaneously searched multiple addresses connected to the Mahmud family and their associates. The goal was not just to gather evidence, but to disrupt the conspiracy and prevent suspects from communicating with each other about their responses to police questions. The searches yielded mixed results. While officers found no immediate evidence of Banaz's whereabouts, they did discover items that suggested planning for the disposal of evidence. More importantly, the raids allowed investigators to observe the behavior and responses of various family members and community associates. The investigation's first major breakthrough came with the arrest of Muhammad Murid Hama on February 4, 2006. Hama was charged with murder, based primarily on Rahmat's positive identification of him as one of the men involved in the attempted kidnapping on January 22nd, combined with his presence on Banaz's list of potential threats. At the time of his arrest, investigators still had no body, no crime scene, and no direct evidence that a murder had taken place. Charging Hama with murder was a calculated risk based on the circumstantial evidence and the urgent need to prevent further suspects from fleeing the country. Hama's arrest sent shockwaves through the Kurdish community in South London. The speed with which he had been charged with murder, despite the absence of a body, demonstrated that the police were taking the case far more seriously than many community members had expected. The arrest also served a strategic purpose. It placed Hama in custody, where his communications could be monitored, and where the pressure of being charged with murder might lead him to provide information about Banaz's whereabouts. What happened next would provide investigators with the most crucial evidence in the entire case. While in custody on remand, Hama began receiving visitors, and what he didn't know was that the authorities had obtained permission to covertly record these conversations. The recordings that followed were devastating. Rather than maintaining his innocence or staying silent, Hama began boasting about his role in Banaz's murder. In conversation after conversation, he provided detailed accounts of the killing that only someone present could have known. "I was kicking and stamping on her neck to get her soul out," Hama bragged to one visitor, describing how he had participated in killing Banaz. He talked about the prolonged sexual assault that had preceded her death, the way she had begged for her life, and the satisfaction he felt at having restored family honor. Most crucially for the investigation, Hama's recorded conversations provided detailed intelligence about the disposal of the body. He described the journey to Birmingham, mentioned specific details about the burial location, and named other family members who had assisted in the cover-up operation. These recordings were not just evidence of Hama's guilt. They were a roadmap that would eventually lead investigators directly to Banaz's remains. Armed with intelligence from the prison recordings, Good's team began expanding their investigation to include other family members mentioned in Hama's conversations. The recordings had directly implicated Banaz's uncle Ari Aga Mahmud as the orchestrator of the murder plot, and her father Mahmud Babakir Mahmud as a willing participant. On May 1, 2006, Ari Aga Mahmud was charged with murder. The evidence against him included not only Hama's recorded statements but also phone records showing his central role in coordinating family meetings and communications in the weeks leading up to Banaz's disappearance. In August 2006, Banaz's father, Mahmud Babakir Mahmud, was also charged with murder. The case against him was built on evidence that he had deliberately left the family home on the morning of January 24th, effectively delivering his daughter into the hands of her killers, and that he had been present at family meetings where her death was planned. The arrest of Banaz's own father and uncle sent another shockwave through both the Kurdish community and British society more broadly. The idea that parents would organize the murder of their own child challenged fundamental assumptions about family relationships and parental love. As the investigation expanded, Good's team encountered unprecedented levels of community obstruction. This wasn't simply the natural reluctance of witnesses to get involved in police investigations. It was an organized campaign of deception designed to protect the suspects and justify the killing. Approximately 50 people were eventually identified as having played some role in the conspiracy, whether in planning the murder, carrying it out, disposing of evidence, or providing false information to investigators. This represented one of the most extensive criminal conspiracies in British legal history. Community members provided false alibis for suspects, claiming to have seen them in different locations at crucial times. Others gave character references for the accused, describing them as peaceful, religious men incapable of violence. Many simply refused to cooperate with investigators at all, claiming either ignorance or fear. The scale of this obstruction was unlike anything Good had encountered in her previous investigations. While facing human obstruction, investigators made crucial progress through technological analysis. The combination of phone records, cell tower data, and automatic number plate recognition (ANPR) cameras provided a digital trail that community lies could not obscure. ANPR cameras had captured images of Dana Amin's black Lexus traveling toward Birmingham on the day after Banaz's murder. The route taken by the vehicle, recorded by multiple cameras along the way, provided technological evidence that corroborated the intelligence gleaned from Hama's prison recordings. On April 28, 2006, nearly 3 months after Banaz's disappearance, the investigation finally achieved its breakthrough. At a house in Handsworth, Birmingham, specialist search teams began a methodical excavation of the back garden. The discovery of Banaz's remains, buried in a suitcase several feet below the surface, transformed the investigation from a missing person case based on circumstantial evidence into a murder inquiry with physical proof. The location matched exactly what Hama had described in his prison recordings, providing independent corroboration for his recorded confessions. The forensic examination of Banaz's remains confirmed the horrific details that Hama had boasted about in custody. Despite the time that had passed, significant forensic evidence had survived, including DNA evidence linking the suspects to the victim and physical evidence supporting the accounts of sexual assault and torture. With Banaz's body found and overwhelming evidence from the prison recordings, Good's team began preparing for trial. The case was complex, involving multiple defendants, cultural factors that would need to be explained to jurors, and a level of violence that would be difficult for anyone to comprehend. The prosecution would need to present evidence spanning several months, multiple countries, and dozens of witnesses. They would need to explain the concept of honor killing to jurors who might never have encountered such extreme manifestations of patriarchal control. The investigation revealed that 2 of the 3 men directly involved in Banaz's murder, Muhammad Saleh Ali and Omar Hussein, had fled to Iraqi Kurdistan immediately after the killing. This presented Good with an unprecedented challenge. Securing justice for Banaz would require the first-ever extradition from Iraq to the United Kingdom. The legal and diplomatic complexities were immense. Iraq's legal system was in chaos following the 2003 invasion. The Kurdistan regional government had limited experience with international extradition requests. There were questions about whether British courts could even prosecute crimes committed by Iraqi citizens who had fled back to their homeland. But Good was determined that distance would not protect Banaz's killers from justice. The investigation expanded to include cooperation with law enforcement agencies in Iraq, diplomatic negotiations with the Kurdistan regional government, and legal proceedings to secure extradition orders that had never before been attempted. In June 2007, the first phase of prosecutions concluded with convictions for 3 key defendants. Mahmoud Babakir Mahmud, Banaz's father, life sentence with minimum 20 years. Ari Aga Mahmud, Banaz's uncle, life sentence with minimum 23 years. Mohammad Marid Hama, life sentence with minimum 17 years, pleaded guilty. The convictions of the family orchestrators represented justice for Banaz, but Good's work was far from finished. 2 of the men who had directly participated in her rape, torture, and murder remained free in Iraqi Kurdistan, apparently confident that they were beyond the reach of British justice. This assumption would prove to be dramatically wrong. The search for Ali required cooperation between British intelligence services, Iraqi security forces, and Kurdish regional authorities. 3 groups that didn't always work well together and had competing priorities and loyalties. British authorities had to convince local officials that pursuing Ali was worth the political and social complications it might create in their communities. The breakthrough came through painstaking police work rather than dramatic raids. Financial records, travel documents, and communication intercepts gradually revealed Ali's networks and movements. Family members in Britain were monitored for any signs of contact with the fugitive. Money transfers and communication patterns were analyzed to identify potential safe houses and support networks. In June 2009, more than 3 years after Banaz's murder, Mohammed Saleh Ali was finally located and arrested by Iraqi Kurdish authorities. The arrest represented a triumph of international cooperation, but it was only the beginning of an even more complex legal battle. While celebrating the success of Ali's extradition, investigators continued their pursuit of Omar Hussein, the 3rd and final member of the team that had murdered Banaz. Hussein had also fled to Iraqi Kurdistan, but his capture would prove even more challenging than Ali's. Intelligence suggested that Hussein had gone into deeper hiding than Ali, moving to more remote areas and receiving protection from family networks that had learned from Ali's arrest. He was reportedly staying in mountainous regions near the Iranian border, areas where central authority was limited and tribal loyalties were paramount. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source: family violence. In December 2009, Hussein was involved in a dispute with one of his brothers that resulted in him being shot in the leg. Seeking medical treatment for his wound, he was forced to present himself at a hospital, where his identity was discovered by authorities who had been watching for exactly such an opportunity. In March 2010, Omar Hussein became the 2nd person extradited from Iraq to Britain, following the legal precedent established by Ali's case, but requiring its own complex negotiations and security arrangements. His arrest and extradition demonstrated that the mechanisms created for Ali's case were not one-time exceptions, but the foundation for ongoing cooperation between British and Iraqi authorities. In November 2010, both Mohammed Saleh Ali and Omar Hussein were convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Mohammed Saleh Ali, life sentence with minimum 22 years. Omar Hussein, life sentence with minimum 21 years. The convictions represented the successful completion of one of the most complex international criminal investigations in British history. From the initial missing person report in January 2006 to the final convictions in November 2010, The case had spanned nearly 5 years and involved cooperation between law enforcement agencies across multiple continents. The case's legal proceedings weren't complete until December 2013, when Dana Amin was convicted for his role in covering up Banaz's murder. Amin, who had helped transport her body to Birmingham and assisted in the burial, was sentenced to 8 years imprisonment for Ling. The sentence sent a clear message to community members who might consider providing support to honor killers. Assistance in covering up such crimes would be prosecuted with the full force of the law, regardless of family relationships or community pressures. The years following the final convictions should have brought Ramat some measure of peace, knowing that he had successfully ensured justice for the woman he loved. Instead, they brought a deepening isolation and depression that the witness protection system was ill-equipped to address. He had given everything to secure Banaz's justice: his community, his identity, his safety, his future, and found himself unable to build a meaningful life from what remained. Living under an assumed identity, permanently exiled from his Kurdish cultural community, haunted by the recorded confessions of Hama, boasting about torturing and murdering Banaz, Ramat faced challenges that went far beyond what traditional witness protection programs were designed to handle. He wasn't just hiding from criminals. He was learning to live as a permanent exile from his own culture, carrying trauma that specialized support services struggled to understand or treat. The isolation was made worse by the very completeness of the justice he had helped achieve. The successful prosecutions meant there was no more legal process requiring his testimony, no more investigations needing his cooperation, no more official reason for the system to maintain contact with him or provide support. He was left alone with his grief, his trauma, and the impossible task of rebuilding an entire life in a world that would always be foreign to him. Friends and advocates who knew Ramat during this period described a man who appeared to function normally, but carried a profound sadness that he could never fully express or resolve. He spoke often of recurring dreams in which he saw Banaz at the sea, reaching for him while he reached for her, but they could never quite touch before she would turn and disappear into the water. They couldn't be together in this life, Banaz's sister Bekhal would later reflect. At least they are in another. In 2016, 10 years after making that first desperate phone call to report Banaz missing, 10 years after his persistence had forced a reluctant police force to take her disappearance seriously, 10 years after his courage had helped bring her killers to justice, Ramat Soleimani took his own life. The 10th anniversary of Banaz's murder seemed to trigger a particularly severe period of psychological crisis. The milestone forced him to confront the reality that a decade had passed since her death, that he had spent more years grieving her loss than he had spent knowing her, and that the future they had planned together would never exist. Ramat's death by suicide was mourned by advocacy organizations, investigators, and legal professionals who understood that the Banaz Mahmud case had ultimately claimed not one victim, but two. His death highlighted one of the most tragic aspects of honor-based violence: its capacity to destroy not just direct victims, but everyone in their orbit who dares to speak truth or seek justice. The young man who had refused to accept that the woman he loved had simply vanished, who had risked everything to ensure her voice would be heard, who had testified against killers who had already proven their willingness to commit murder. This same man ultimately could not survive the psychological devastation that honor-based violence had wrought upon his life. Banaz's story is not just about the life she lost, but about the change her memory continues to inspire. If you believe her voice deserves to be heard, share this video so her story reaches even more people. And if you want to join us as we uncover more cases where justice had to be fought for, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support helps keep these stories alive and ensures they are never forgotten.